An analysis of realist and liberal perspectives. Case study, the United Nations. Part 1, the realist perspective. Within the field of international relations, realists place an emphasis on conflict and war. This is not because they enjoy war, rather, they hope to avoid it through studying the subject. A realist will tell you that they believe the causes of war related to power, and that it is every state's primary goal to acquire as much power as possible. Oftentimes, realists see stronger states exercising their power to dominate weaker states. Because of the emphasis placed on war, military spending is a vital role in the security of a state. This graph helps give perspective on how different states of the world apply the realist outlook to national security. At first glance, it can be deciphered how closely the United States applies the realist perspective. Let us now examine the key concepts in relation to this perspective. Realists put the concept of power at the forefront of their perspective. They define power as the material capabilities of a country. This includes the size of population and territory, resource endowment, economic capability, and military strength. Realists view the international system as being in a state of anarchy. Realists define anarchy as the lack of a leader or center of authority that monopolizes coercive power and has the legitimacy to use it. As a result, realists place their emphasis on the study of states. States are the actors within the contemporary international system that have the largest capability and right to use military action. A key distinguishing factor of a state is sovereignty. Sovereignty is the attribute of states which does not hold them subordinate to any higher authority. Two types of states that can be potentially dangerous are failed states and rogue states. A failed state is one whose institutions have collapsed. A rogue state is a state that seeks to acquire nuclear weapons with the intent of passing them to non-state terrorists. There are two schools of thought within the realist perspective: power balancing realists and power transition realists. Power balancing realists view hegemony as a destabilizing factor, and war is most likely when a dominant power emerges to threaten the equilibrium of power among other states. Comparatively, power transition realists view hegemony as a stabilizing factor, and war is most likely when a rising power challenges the previously dominant one and the balance of power approaches equilibrium. To draw a comparison to the real world, President George W. Bush's executive cabinet had both schools of realism. Secretary of State Colin Powell, pictured left, was a power balancing realist, while Vice President Dick Cheney, pictured right, was a power transition realist. Part 2. The liberal perspective. The liberal perspective places a heavy emphasis on cooperation and bargaining. They believe that diplomacy and negotiations, not war, are the best means of solving most problems. For liberals, war is always the most costly option, so countries will always look for lower-cost conflict resolutions. Liberals believe that violence and conflict can be overcome by centralizing and legitimating power in institutions. They focus on frequent interactions and processes to determine how actors will cooperate. Let us now examine the key concepts of the liberal perspective. Because of the emphasis placed on cooperation, interdependence is an important facet of the liberal perspective. Interdependence is the mutual dependence of states and non-state actors in the international system through various interactions. When states negotiate things, such as policies or treaties, bargaining is the tool most often employed. Bargaining is what is used to distribute the gains of an otherwise zero-sum game. One outlet that can aid in this process is our international institutions. International institutions create international laws, customary rules, and codify the treaties under which international organizations operate. Oftentimes, international institutions like the United Nations conduct post-conflict reconstruction. This refers to the activities aimed at helping individuals in areas that have been ravaged by ethnic conflict. This chart shows that there has been a significant increase in the number of signatories to arms agreements in the past 10 years. This data implies that there has been an increase in reliance on diplomacy rather than force, and from the liberal perspective, this is to be expected. Part 3. The United Nations. The United Nations was formed in 1945 as a response to the tragedies of World War II. The organization was designed to avoid the reoccurrence of such an event and help maintain peace within the world. The organization deals with three major international issues: collective security and peace, which is handled by the UN Security Council; economic and social development, handled by the Economic and Social Council; and international law and human rights, which is handled by the International Court of Justice. From the liberal perspective, the United Nations is seen in a positive light. The UN places an emphasis on cooperation and bargaining, and this can be seen through their membership statistics. In the United Nations, there are currently 193 member states, along with 124,000 personnel serving on 16 different peace operations throughout the world. From the liberal perspective, the United Nations is an organization that enforces international law and ensures collective security. One of its most notable successes was in the Persian Gulf War. After Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, their actions were met with unanimous condemnation from world leaders. To aid Kuwait and avoid Iraq setting a precedent of intruding on state sovereignty, the UN, led by U.S. troops, successfully expelled Iraq from the collective security was restored. Another positive impact the liberal perspective accredits to the UN is that they can act as a means of legitimizing state actions and creating a standard for multilateralism. This was partially seen in 2002 when President George W. Bush, under the advice of Secretary of State Colin Powell, brought forth the proposal to use military force in Iraq to the UN Security Council. In comparison, realists view the United Nations in a negative light. Realists place their emphasis on state institutions, so as a result, states will always put domestic interest above international. An example of this can be seen in the United States' response to the events in Somalia. In 1993, after a Somalian warlord killed 18 U.S. soldiers during a UN humanitarian effort, President Clinton began to pull U.S. troops from the country. In response to this event, the Clinton administration reformed U.S. policies related to aiding the UN. One result of these reforms was cutting funding for the UN initiatives by 25%. Another criticism realists would have of the UN is that it provides an institutional force for strong actors to dominate weak actors. This can be seen in the UN Security Council. The Council is comprised of 5 permanent members, which are primarily world powers, and 10 non-permanent members. Realists would argue that this structure does not distribute power appropriately and does not allow for medium and regional powers to have an adequate voice. Realists would also find cooperation among states to be difficult because states seek to attain and retain as much power as possible. An example of this would be the United States' disregard for NATO assistance or UN approval during the 2003 invasion of Iraq.